Hello. As we here at NIOT join the celebration of our nation's 250th birthday, we've launched a video project called Foundations of Freedom, which celebrates the role of New York towns in American history. Although often told through great events and national milestones, the foundation of America was laid locally, in towns where civic life took shape, communities formed, and democratic ideals were put into practice every day. Nowhere is that more evident than in New York's towns, where histories reflect the perseverance, ingenuity, and public spirit that have helped shape our nation for nearly 250 years. Foundations of Freedom brings together the voices of towns from across New York State to honor that shared legacy. Each story in this series offers a glimpse into the town's origins, growth, and defining moments.
Hello everyone, my name's Vinny Crocito, supervisor of the town of Lake George. I just want to comment on how important our history is to us, how important the partnerships and collaborations that we've developed through John DiNuzzo and the Battlefield Park Alliance have meant to elevating the awareness of our history. In the past, you needed to seek it out more. John has organized and brought it to our attention that this is where the seeds of our independence were planted.
My name is John DiNuzzo. I'm the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, a nonprofit that oversees the beautiful Lake George Battlefield Park at Lake George. I'm also a member of the town planning board for the town of Lake George. Well, Lake George, the lake, was the highway of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, through which, the important economic capitals of Montreal and New York, this was a key passageway. We have Interstate 87 today. We've had, train routes and canals in between those times. But basically in the 18th century, that was the way you got between those two economic hubs of New York and Montreal. Was really the no man's land, or the point of demarcation between the British influence in the south, the French influence in the north. When the French built Fort Carillon in 1755, after the Battle of Lake George, modern-day Ticonderoga, that marked their southernmost incursion. Lake George, the body of water, became the no man's land and the source of the battles. So that's why right up through the end of the 1700s, the American Revolution, Lake George was the fighting place, so to speak. It was the point that the British went as far north as they could. Even though they outnumbered something like 7-1 the French population, the British kept moving northward because of the luxury of furs and other things that the forest would produce. So the British came as far north, ultimately through Sir William Johnson, as the southern end of Lake George, which he named for King George II in 1755. And the French, to the reverse, basically filtered down from Quebec and points west as well. But basically, again, it was this lucrative fur trade that lured the French. The waters were so prosperous for hunting and fishing to Native Americans for centuries. The French also took advantage of. Ultimately, those two forces, long histories of antipathy anyway in Europe, would kind of come into combat and come into conflict at Lake George and points surrounding Lake George. So it was inevitable almost that those two areas should come into conflict, and the French and the British would come in conflict that way. Now, the French and Indian War, so named because it was the French with their Indian allies, inevitably was an outcome of the 7 Years' War, which was pretty much global between France and England. The British, with the exception of the Mohawks, were by and large, fighting with their own forces. But the Mohawks were a key constituency and an ally of theirs. Our statue in Lake George Battlefield Park depicts Sir William Johnson and his key ally, King Hendrick, the sachem of the Mohawk tribe, which is a senior esteemed leader. And it was King Hendrick who was killed at the Battle of Lake George in 1755. and kind of set the stage for the almost schizophrenia between the Native Americans. To this day, there's a Mohawk historian named Darren Bonaparte who considers that the saddest day in Mohawk history, that Battle of Lake George, because you had Mohawks fighting Mohawks and other Indian tribes, resulting in the death of a very esteemed leader, King Hendrik. Beyond that, in 1776 and late 75, early 76, the Americans tried to capture Canada, and they were unsuccessful, and many of the soldiers came back infected with smallpox, so severe that it was determined by the Continental Army leadership to segregate the infected soldiers from the rest of the healthy soldiers. As a result, they established a smallpox hospital here at Lake George, which served over 3,000 patients in the summer of 1776. Unfortunately, probably a quarter to a third of them perished and were buried on the spot at Lake George, resulting in the discovery, throughout the recent history of remains of Continental soldiers, such as those that were found here in 2019. We're going to reinter them in Lake George Battlefield Park through a great effort the town of Lake George led over the past 6 years to do that in a very respectful and memorable way. But certainly the smallpox hospital, the largest the Continental Army had throughout the Revolution, being here is a prominent part of our history and a Revolution history.
This building is when we uncovered all of the remains that we call the Cortlandt Street remains. Right now, up to 44 sets of individuals who were uncovered just in the area of the excavation from the foundation. Originally planned here was 2 buildings. So the second building was not ever built, nor will it ever be built, because there is the assumption that there are more sets of remains underneath this half of the property. So there's been this 6-year-long effort to figure out how to respectfully reinter these remains, who are associated, some of them we believe associated with the 1st Pennsylvania Battalion, who were a regiment of the Continental Army during the campaign John spoke about. We call it the Quebec campaign, where America was actually trying to take over parts of Canada, and they went basically up the lake to try to take over. It was a failed effort, and they came back down, and during that time frame, many of them got sick and contracted smallpox. As John mentioned, there was a smallpox hospital set up here down in Battlefield Park, and we believe that a large portion of this general vicinity was actually the burying ground for those who perished from smallpox. Last year, we were able to get this Pomeroy sign erected. So just another historical marker. We have plenty throughout town, but this one is actually specific to the burial ground. And it just says on there, the soldiers of the 1st Pennsylvania Battalion were buried here. Members of the battalion died at the military hospital at Fort George in 76, same year as the basically revolution sort of was cemented, right, and declaration signed. So this was a relatively important part of the role that Lake George played in that American Revolution. A couple years ago, Lake George Park Commission, the state, actually a state entity, they regulate the lake, right? So boats, docks, piers, all the stuff that's in the body of water, regulated by our friends at the Park Commission. He had pitched the idea of a museum in the lower level. And so it came to be. We were lucky enough that everybody liked the idea. There's a couple specific things that I want to show you in relation to the Revolutionary War. But in terms of our essay and what we're doing here in the park, reinterring the soldiers from Cortlandt Street, this is probably the most prominent. This is a mannequin dressed in 1st Pennsylvania Battalion garb. So I think I gave you one of the buttons. This is the actual coat that the 1st Pennsylvania Battalion soldiers, and we assume the one that we found with buttons at Cortlandt Street was an officer, would have been wearing at the time. So the coolest part about all of this is we're like one segment in this long path, right? And so last weekend Ticonderoga had stuff. This weekend there'll be a couple things further south in the Saratoga region, up to the border with Massachusetts. And along the way are a lot of these monuments that were recently erected, commemorating the artillery train. So that's relatively new. The first marker for Knox in the park.
As we look to the north and wonder what it was like 250 years ago, where ice was already forming on the lake, we are anxiously awaiting this reenactment. Henry Knox expecting to be delivering the goods coming up to the shoreline somewhere around between 3 and 3:15. So thank you for gathering here and supporting this very special event.